Okay. Obviously, the question of automation and technology has become one of the key issues of our age, which is often characterized as a digital age, in the sense of obviously one which a society now dominated by smartphones, by social networks, artificial intelligence. And there's obviously a plethora of revolutionary potential out there in terms of this technology. The idea of driverless cars, virtual reality, 3D printing, all of this makes possible the idea of a world of superabundance and of a world of abundance of leisure time as well. But as the title of this session suggests, there's actually a lot of hope and fear at the same time in equal measure on this sort of question. On the one hand, you have these futurologists whose imaginations kind of run wild when they see the potential technology that's out there. The possibility of full automation, as it's called, or basically an end to work. But then alongside this, there's also a lot of apprehension and anxiety on this question. You see phrases like technological unemployment, the idea that basically robots are going to take all of our jobs, a race against the machine, as it's sometimes been called. And in fact, this comes from the idea that obviously, we can see that jobs are being lost to machinery, to technology, to robots and so forth. And increasingly, this technological change is happening at such a fast pace that people are being left behind and unable to kind of keep up with this ever-accelerating treadmill. In fact, there was one study done in Oxford, I think, quite recently, where two academics, I think they came up with an estimate that in America, by 2030, something like 50% of jobs currently existing could be automated away. And a lot of that is not just the kind of traditional manufacturing jobs that have already been lost largely, not lost to China and to globalization, but actually lost to machinery and automation. Not just those, but also now a kind of sweeping job losses through offices, through white-collar jobs, as artificial intelligence, and these sorts of technologies make it much easier to replace people in accounting and even law firms and things like this. These are the kind of jobs that are predicted to be under threat over the next decade. And I think it's within this kind of context that you see the emergence of the idea of a universal basic income. The idea of that, just in brief, is that it's an unconditional payment made to every citizen, regardless of their age, their wealth, or their employment status. That's basically, in a sentence, what universal basic income means. But what you see with UBI is that actually the opinions about it are equally as split as the kind of hopes and fears around technology and automation in general. On the one hand, you see a section of the left in particular, progressives, who kind of think of the idea of UBI as a step towards some sort of fully automated luxury communism, as the phrase has sometimes been used. In other words, a kind of a society where, because of this technology, we can fulfill Marx's maxim that everyone can work according to their ability and take according to their needs. Some people see UBI as almost like a stepping stone onto that path. And also it's been argued on the left that UBI, in the very short term at least, would guarantee a kind of bigger safety net, a better welfare state that workers could fall back on, and that this in turn would kind of liberate them to go on strike more, or to be able to pursue other creative paths and so forth. It would give workers some sort of better bargaining position in the workplace against the bosses. However, on the other side, you do also see a lot of people noting that this UBI policy has been also proposed by some of the most ardent kind of libertarian right-wingers, people who see it as basically an attempt to kind of get away with the bureaucracy of the welfare state as they see it. Better to just scrap all the kind of public services and the means-tested benefits and so forth, and instead just give a paltry amount to everyone and use that basically as some sort of fig leaf behind which the general dynamics of capitalism, the general exploitation in the workplace can continue at full speed. And in fact, you have seen throughout history the idea of UBI being proposed by the right wing. In fact, Milton Friedman was in favour of something similar, a negative income tax he called it, but the idea was generally the same. So I think the fact that you see on both these questions, on automation and UBI, which are linked together through, as I've discussed, that I think it's the fact that you see the public opinion kind of split and the mood towards these things split, I think it reflects the fact that in general there is not a Marxist position, really, a Marxist approach taken in analysing these questions. I think what you often see is that things like technology and UBI, when they're talked about in any of the kind of the mainstream press and so forth, mainstream commentators, it's always from a point of looking at it in isolation, looking at technological progress as some sort of kind of process that takes place kind of independently of the rest of society, as though there's just, obviously there is its own laws. There is a kind of self-contained logic, if you like, within technological progress. But I think divorcing this and the question of UBI as well from the general political context within which we see them, within the economic context within which we see them, you arrive at this kind of confused and contradictory position. I think we have to really focus, when we're looking at technological progress and economic demands like UBI, economic reforms, we can't divorce them from these wider political questions. We have to raise those political questions, say, at the end of the day, as with all reforms, who's going to pay for UBI? Who owns and controls the technology in society in the first place? And most importantly, in whose interest are any of these things being brought about? And I think to understand and answer that, we have to go back and take a Marxist approach and look at actually what Marx himself wrote on this kind of questions. Marx was very prophetic in many respects. If you read his economic writings, a lot of the kind of discussions that are taking place today were already answered in embryo by Marx in things like Capital, where he discusses, there's a whole chapter actually dedicated to the question of machinery, and already looking at this question, you already had movements like the Luddites, where these mass movements of kind of rebellions of workers against the machines, against the automated looms and so forth, the mechanized looms, and they saw that as a threat to their jobs, and they smashed the machinery up, showing the kind of fear they had that these machines were going to take their jobs. And it's very similar, obviously, to what we see today, and Marx commented on those movements at the time. And what Marx said about machinery is obviously we've got to see it within its economic context, which is capitalism, the system that we live in. Capitalism, a system where what we have is a generalized production and exchange of commodities, a system of production for profit. And these commodities, these products that are produced for exchange, they have a value. They have a relative value compared to other commodities, and that is dependent, Marx says, on the socially necessary labour time. In other words, the amount of labour time within a historical epoch, given the current levels of technology and education and so forth, there is a value associated, amount of a socially necessary labour time gone into creating these commodities, the average time taken based on the kind of current levels of technology and technique. And the key to understanding this is obviously the fact that labour itself is the source of all value. Things don't have value if they don't require any labour time put into them. And Marx didn't just talk about the labour of the actual process itself, but also the labour contained within the raw materials and the technology that comes before any given production process. In other words, there's all the commodities that go into producing new commodities, the raw materials, the machines. All of these transfer their value over into the new commodity. Marx called it dead labour, congealed or crystallised dead labour from the past. And in this respect, machinery does not create any value itself, but rather transfers its value onto the new product. And so, it's human labour itself, it's mankind's force on its world around us that creates value, and the machines cannot produce any value. And that's very key, because as capitalism is a system of production for profit, and profit, Marx explains, is derived ultimately from the unpaid labour of the working class. And if machines therefore cannot create profit for the capitalists, it's only the application of labour and the production of surplus value, a value above and beyond what's paid back to the workers in the form of wages, that can create profits. And that's a key idea that I'll come back to in a minute. Now, it's competition, obviously, in the drive to make more profits that chases the capitalists not only across the world to create a world market, but also forces them to reinvest their surplus, reinvest their profits into new machinery, into new technology, into new science and research and development and so forth. And the aim of that is obviously to try and reduce their costs overall, to replace labour with machines, to increase the kind of efficiency and productivity of production. And if they can do that as an individual capitalist, they can reduce the labour time of their products below that socially necessary average. In other words, they can sell at a lower price than what's offered on the market, outcompete their competitors, and push their fellow capitalists out of business. And so, therefore, that's the drive, if you like, to invest in all of this machinery and so forth. It's ultimately to try and to increase the productivity, to increase the amount of wealth, the amount of products that can be produced in a given amount of time, and as I say, that's caused this in its heyday, what was actually a very progressive process under capitalism. Marx actually, if you see the Communist Manifesto, he's full of praise for capitalism in saying it's achieved wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids and Roman aqueducts. He had a great reverence for capitalism as a progressive system in its heyday that was this drive, this competition, forcing the capitalists to invest and create the incredible wonders in terms of technology and a superabundance of wealth that obviously we see around us today. The problem is, under capitalism, because capitalism is fundamentally a system of private ownership over this technology, over the means of production by which wealth is produced, the problem arises that this whole process of technological development, of investment in new machinery and new technology, all of this process occurs in a very unplanned, in a very anarchic way, in a very contradictory way as a result. Where you have technology being introduced not in the interests of society as a whole, not in order to free up workers in terms of their leisure time, reduce the hours of the working week and reduce the burden on the working class, but rather this technology is being introduced fundamentally, as I said, to improve productivity from the point of view of the capitalists, to improve their profits and make them super profits, to capture new markets. That's really the basis behind all drive for new technology in society. It's the fact that it might along the way provide some sort of social benefit is accidental as far as the capitalist is concerned. And this obviously leads to the reason why you get these kind of hopes and fears about technology. It expresses the contradictory process of technological development, of how it's introduced through this invisible hand, through the market, rather than in a planned and rational way. And in fact, the capitalists themselves even have a term for this. Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, a kind of forefather of kind of neoliberal economics, a peer of kind of Hayek and these types, he came up with the term creative destruction to describe how capitalism progresses in this way. In other words, he saw what capitalism would do is, yes, it would create new jobs, yes, it would create new industries, but it would first have to destroy the old ones to free up labour, to free up capital and so forth. And therefore, he thought the market was the best way of doing this. It would allocate resources in the most efficient way. And obviously, just a look back at history shows how utopian this idea was and how divorced from reality it was. Look at what's happened in terms of obsolete industries like mining in Britain. This was not closed down in a kind of, in a calm, gradual way in which the workers were retrained and then moved into new jobs, but rather you had the full force of the state destroying the miners' industry, closing down the mines, and trying to break the whole back of the labour movement. And it's left obviously a scar of unemployment in these regions. And the same is true in a lot of places today. You see, this in Wales right now, for example, the steel industries at Port Talbot closed down as a result of the glut of steel that's produced on a world scale. This huge overproduction of steel, actually, that's found its way onto the world market, and the jobs there cannot be kept in order to provide for other things, other socially necessary things, but rather are just closed down, and those industries are left, and those whole communities, in fact, are left behind. So you see, yes, there is new jobs and technology created, but it's always for the benefit of the 1%, if you like, or even the 0.01%. They're the ones who benefit from these productivity gains and from this wealth that's created. And simultaneously, obviously, millions are left behind, are left on the scrap heap, and are forced actually into very precarious jobs, into very low pay and very low productive jobs. In fact, I think the fact that you see today these two things conditioning one another. You know, on the one hand, we've got these incredibly productive industries in terms of like the tech monopolies that kind of dominate a lot of the global economy today. The Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks of this world that are worth billions and are sitting on cash piles of billions. On the one hand, they are incredibly productive in terms of the value they're producing with a relatively small workforce, but it's a very educated workforce. You know, it's a very elite workforce that's kind of plucked from the best universities and so forth. And they are earning a bomb, you know, not only the executives, but some of these very high-end workers there. But at the same time, the jobs that they've displaced, the people who are displaced by the kind of technologies they're creating, are going into this gig economy that is in fact run by the same technology firms, you know, the Ubers and the Deliveroos of this world, which are actually very low productive jobs when you look at it. Like, why are we paying people to cycle around London, often like risking their lives given how fast they're going and ignoring all the traffic? You know, that is very low productive work, you know, literally back-breaking work and on a very low pay as well. So it shows you how the two things have conditioned each other. The productivity gains in the hands of the 1% have meant to this general lowering of living standards and degradation of work for the rest. It's in fact, the two, as I say, condition each other because the what Marx called the reserve army of labour that is created by this kind of technological unemployment. The fact that there are machines that can work instead of workers to do these jobs, it obviously puts a downward pressure on wages in general, alongside the political attacks on the unions, the globalization and the kind of competition of workers worldwide. All of this has put a downward pressure on wages to the extent that actually it's now, in fact, cheaper in many cases to use an army of low-paid workers than it is to invest in a machine in the first place. Why re-kit your whole factory with a new productive process if you can just get in a load of people on zero-hour contracts in an Amazon warehouse or something like that to just literally be picking up the boxes and taking them from A to B? That shows you how these two processes condition each other. And actually, it's a process that Marx himself commented on in Capital. I think it's in chapter 15, the one on machinery. If you want to learn more, you can buy an excellent book over there called Understanding Capital by yours truly and Rob Sewell. It's got, obviously, highlights all the sections in that chapter where Marx talks about this process, where he actually predicts and says, you know, you can get this situation where capitalism itself becomes the barrier to the deployment of technology, where it becomes more efficient, if you like. It becomes more cost-effective, rather, from the point of view of the capitalist. It's rational from their point of view to not invest in machinery, to not invest in technology, and to just use this army of cheap labour that they've helped to create in the first place. And this is all taking place, obviously, at the same time in the context of a general crisis of overproduction, where you've got this vast glut of commodities produced on a world scale that cannot be absorbed by the market. It cannot be absorbed by the workers themselves on the measly wages. And in fact, automation and the replacement of wage labour with machines exacerbates this process even further. There's actually quite a good, I think, unfortunately, an apocryphal story, but nevertheless quite an interesting story anyway that demonstrates this point, where apparently Henry Ford, he of kind of fame for creating kind of automation on a mass scale, apparently he was being taken round one of his newly automated factories by a trade union rep, and Henry Ford pointed at the machines and the robots, and he said to the trade union rep kind of very proudly, you know, like, I'm going to break the back of your union, because how are you going to get these machines to pay your union dues, to pay your union membership fees? And the union rep just turns around quick as a flash and says, yeah, but how are you going to get the robots to buy your cars? And that's the point, right, under capitalism. You know, the machines that are producing this glut of commodities at the end of the day, obviously with human labour involved in it, but very minimal, you know, increasingly minimal amount of human labour. But then how the machines don't need any goods they're not buying anything, they don't get an income. And it's the working class which is seeing their conditions eroded over time, attacked over time, finding itself increasingly difficult to actually buy back all these goods. And in fact, under capitalism, the working class can never buy back all these goods because of the nature of capitalism and how profit is created in the first place as the unpaid labour of the working class. and expresses, if you like, the real crisis-ridden, the inherently crisis-ridden nature of capitalism. But understanding that process, I think, also helps explain some of these kind of seemingly paradoxical questions that have arisen today. There's a very popular kind of zeitgeist theme within a lot of the kind of financial and economic kind of papers and journals now, and it's increasingly kind of being raised elsewhere, which is this idea of the productivity puzzle. There's a lot of people in the press these days talking about, very clearly, actually, you can see it in the statistics. This is worrying the capitalists themselves, worrying the ruling class, which is there's a general stagnation actually taking place in productivity. Whereas in the past period, in the 19th century, the earlier 20th, you had big innovations, big technologies making huge leaps forward in terms of technology, the electricity, the railways, things like this, that massively boosted productivity figures. In the last few decades, not just since the crisis of 2008, but even before that, in Britain and America and other advanced capitalist countries, you've seen a stagnation of productivity. In other words, reflecting the fact that you've got exactly this process I'm talking about going on, and it seems very paradoxical, because on the one hand, there's this fear that there's too much automation taking place, that we're all about to lose our jobs to robots, or already losing our jobs to robots. And on the other hand, we're being told, well, actually, there's not enough technology because productivity is stagnated. And that contradiction seems, precisely as it is, it seems like a paradox, and that's why they call it the productivity puzzle. And all the bourgeois economists scratch their heads and come up with all sorts of mysterious explanations for why this might be the case. Maybe it's a statistical error, they say, or just some sort of measurement error. But it actually comes back to this contradictory way in which technology is being introduced, where there are massive productivity gains and huge amounts of people are being, made obsolete, if you like, from the point of view of capitalism. But the point is, they're not unemployed, they're not just left completely in the scrap heap, they're forced into these very low productivity jobs, like the gig economy, as I said, and that lowers the average productivity across the whole of society, across the whole economy. And that's really the long and the short of this puzzle that has the kind of bourgeois economists so confused. But it's very simple if you understand it from a point of view of capitalism and how capitalism works. In other words, it's what Marx describes very clearly as accumulation of wealth at one pole and accumulation of misery and toil at the other. That's fundamentally what this process amounts to. And it reflects, as I say, the contradictory nature of technological progress under capitalism, which Engels also talked about in his pamphlet Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, which I think is also available at the back to buy. And it's an excellent pamphlet, where in the third chapter he talks about, again, the development of capitalism historically, and he points out something very interesting. He says, look, there's actually within capitalism, despite what the free marketeers always tell you about the free market being the most efficient system, Engels points out within any capitalist firm, there's an enormous level of planning that actually goes on. Just in the last session we were talking about this in terms of, in any supermarket, the planning that goes on from the shops and the supermarkets down to the farms and the factories in terms of, knowing this kind of supply chain that's incredibly complex, knowing how much to order in and so forth of any product, and all of that done by customers themselves. Obviously, you've got self-checkout machines, another good example of automation replacing the tillers who used to be there. And all of that going on. It's an incredible level of planning, actually, when you think about it. But obviously, within the firm, it takes place not to lower the hours of the workers, that workers have to work or anything, but to increase the profits of the capitalism. And between different firms, Engels points out, anarchy reigns. You have the anarchy of the market where there's no planning at all. And it's that that dualism, if you like, that contradiction that means that these new technologies and techniques are not distributed. The gains of them, the productivity gains, are not distributed across the whole economy. And it's within all of this that we see, as I say, this so-called solution being proposed, particularly on the left, of UBI, of the Universal Basic Income, which is meant to somehow kind of recompense obsolete workers and the 99% in society by providing them with some sort of basic unconditional income. And it actually stems from an idea proposed long ago by Thomas Paine, who proposed it as a basically a tax on the landlords. He said, look, they're generating all this rent from the land, and they should give some of it back, and there should be a tax on the landlords, tax on their rents, and an income given to all citizens. And actually, interestingly, Thomas Paine raised it not as a revolutionary demand particularly, but actually as a way of trying to co-opt the whole of society into the current status quo. He said, I'm not trying to get rid of the landlords and their kind of parasitic nature. Rather, I'm going to, in order to justify having them there in the first place and stop people rebelling against them, we're going to tax some of their rents and kind of co-opt people in. Say, look, you can be a part of our society, be a part of, be a citizen in this land, but fundamentally the status quo will stay the same. The exploiters and the exploited will still exist. And I think that's very key to understanding the question of UBI today, because UBI is not an automatically progressive policy, and in fact there's no such thing as an automatically progressive policy or an automatically progressive technology in society. We have to look at these things in terms of who's raising them and in whose interests. I think if it was raised as part of a radical left-wing program, as part of a general program to improve the lives of ordinary people, to improve the conditions of the working class, obviously UBI would be something that you would support. If it was funded by making the rich pay for it, by providing a stronger safety net and welfare state, obviously, like any reform, we as Marxists would support that. Marxists do not reject reforms because they somehow maintain capitalism. There is unfortunately some ultra-left types who call themselves very revolutionary, who think that you shouldn't even support reforms because it dampens the appetite for revolution, or it somehow accelerates conditions to being so bad that you'll have people trying to overthrow capitalism even quicker. No, we don't believe that. As genuine Marxists, fight for any reform, but obviously point out that they can only be guaranteed on the basis of a mass movement that actually goes to abolish capitalism and overthrow capitalism and transform society along socialist lines. So as part of a general left program, obviously we would support this as a stepping stone towards that, as a transitional demand, if you like, in that process, to give confidence to workers to fight to change society. But we've also got to see, as I say, that there's people on the libertarian right wing who are raising this, as I say, to provide some sort of facade behind which the exploitation, the status quo of oppression and exploitation can continue, and in fact continue at an ever greater pace, because obviously it gives a veneer of improvement for the workers. Meanwhile, the bosses can continue to cut wages, you continue to have austerity on public services and so forth. And it doesn't do anything, as I say, to really challenge fundamentally that question of who owns and controls the power and the economy in society. Now, as I said earlier, some people who've advocated UBI from the left, they put forward it as a solution because they say, well, it will help people in the gig economy. It'll strengthen their position. If they're not having to worry about being made unemployed and losing their job and being made, completely impoverished overnight, if they know there's that safety net to fall back on, that means they can fight to improve their conditions. It means they can not have to take on the most exploitative jobs, and it will improve, therefore, the general push for better wages across the working class. And we've got to say, yes, obviously it would do that if it was introduced. But you've got to ask yourself, this kind of chicken and egg problem here. Who would introduce such a UBI in the first place? How would you get to have this nice position, this strengthened position for the working class in the first place? Obviously, the only way you could introduce such a policy is if the state itself introduces it. And what kind of state would do that? It would have to be a radical left government putting it in place under pressure from below, on the back of a mass movement. And the point is that such a government would already necessarily be trying to improve workers' conditions across the board. It would be trying to strengthen the trade union laws, strengthen workers' rights and so forth, and standing up for workers against the big tech monopolies, against the big businesses and so forth. In other words, that kind of economic gain of UBI cannot be divorced from the general question of class struggle, of political struggle and political power. And the other key point is obviously who pays. That has to be our question with any demand, any reform. If we're going to ask whether it's really being introduced in a progressive way or not, is who pays for it. A UBI actually would be enormously expensive. And this is obviously raised as one of the criticisms from the right wing. I think in Switzerland they actually had a referendum on the question of UBI, which failed because there was this hysteria raised about how much taxes would have to increase. And there's other studies that show that in America, for example, a $10,000 a year basic income, which is hardly an enormous amount actually, would result in a 10% increase, a 10 percentage point increase in terms of the taxes raised. And you'd have to say, well, who's going to pay those taxes? Because it's very clear already under capitalism that the big tech companies, the big monopolies, the banks, they're not willing to pay these taxes already. As we've discussed throughout this weekend, there are threats to withdraw their money. And in fact, the people who are most guilty of this tax dodging are actually often the tech companies themselves, like Google and Facebook, which are kind of facing court cases over these things. And the people who are trying to circumvent the existing kind of workers' rights are people like Uber. You know, look at the battle that's going on in London right now about the banning of Uber. It shows these companies do not respect workers' rights, they do not respect paying their taxes, and they will do anything they can to try and dodge it. And it's true, obviously, of the capitalist class in general. So you've got, within that context, this crisis of capitalism and the big monopolies already doing everything they can to avoid paying for that crisis. You're having the people on the left saying, well, look, let's have an even bigger shake-up of the welfare state. It's almost kind of a double or nothing sort of approach. And it's kind of quite utopian in a socialist sense, utopian socialist sort of sense. They've come up with a nice blueprint and imagine it can just fall from the sky because it kind of, you know, this manna from heaven will just come in because it makes so much sense and it'll benefit everyone. And it comes down to this idea really that somehow the austerity we're seeing, the attacks we're seeing are just ideological, that they're just the result of nasty capitalists, and that somehow you could persuade the capitalists to be less nasty, to get rid of austerity, to get rid of the attacks, to put these sort of things in place because they themselves might benefit a bit from it. In other words, there's a reliance here with these kind of demands on basically kind of a philanthropic sort of capitalist, you know, reliance on a benevolence of the capitalist class and on the benevolence of the capitalist state to kind of carry these things out. And it really raises, again, all the questions we've discussed this weekend already about the nature of the state under capitalism and the fact that obviously it exists not as a neutral entity that exists to kind of protect the majority of people in society, but rather, in the words of Lenin, it is ultimately armed bodies of men in defense of private property, in defense of the interests of the ruling class. And therefore, you know, you're not going to get the capitalist state, you know, a Tory government or any kind of philanthropic Silicon Valley entrepreneurs introducing these kind of ideas, as much as you might have the odd person here and there advocating it. In fact, one person who has been quite prominent in this debate is Bill Gates, obviously one of the richest men in the world, who's all in favour of giving some of his money away when it's on his terms. But I imagine if anyone said, right, let's nationalise Microsoft then, he'd probably have a problem with that. So it shows you how limited the philanthropy really is. But what he has suggested, interestingly, is the idea that you should tax the robots to pay for this. Oh, that's very nice, isn't it? Don't tax the rich. No, they can keep their money. Tax the robots. Now that sounds great, but who are we taxing here? Are we going to tax Wall-E? Are we going to tax Terminator? Like, I mean, it's a farcical idea, really. Like, these robots aren't walking around people who have an income that you can tax. There's machinery, there's technology, there's software in society, including software made by Microsoft that is making people redundant because, you know, why have a secretary anymore when you can have a word processor or a Google Translate and these kind of things. You know, there's obviously all of that technology out there that is creating these productivity gains and making workers obsolete. But how do you tax that? You're going to tax the software? You're going to tax the individual, computers and so forth? It's a farcical idea. And really the only thing it could possibly mean, if it makes any sense at all, is if you were to tax the profits derived from the machines and the people who employ them. In other words, to tax the profits of the rich. But obviously that, from a capitalist point of view, would lead to the opposite of what's intended. Because if you tax the rich, you tax them for investing and making the process more productive, then instead they're going to rely not on investing in machinery, but on employing that army of labour that low-paid labour, that low-productivity labour that I talked about earlier. So rather than actually improving the situation for the majority of people, you'd end up with a situation where we had even more reliance on low pay and low productivity. In other words, what it shows you really is these kind of reformist solutions to try and introduce these sort of reformist measures always end up actually producing the opposite of what's intended. You try and regulate capitalism, you don't get a kinder form of capitalism. What you get is the worst of both worlds. You neither get the kind of the creative destruction, if you like, of the free market, which the libertarians advocate, nor would you have a proper planned economy in the way that we would advocate. You get the worst of both worlds, and it shows you always the limits of trying to solve these sort of problems. And highlights the kind of dead end of reformism in these processes. The point we've got to make is, we're not against productivity and automation and efficiency. The problem obviously arises that the gains of automation only accrue in private hands, and the losses of any lack of automation, also that burden falls on the shoulders of the working class in the form of things like the gig economy. And you see this similarly with things like the Uber ban, actually, like the reformist approach in this situation where you've got Uber kind of misbehaving, trying to bully local governments and so forth into accepting, and bully workers into accepting poor conditions. The solution in London has just been to ban this company outright. But what have you ended up with? 40,000 jobs potentially at risk, and what a service that's become quite vital to a lot of people has actually also potentially under threat. The real solution is not just to ban these sort of companies, but to say, look, they should be brought in-house. They should be brought into public ownership. We already have a transport network that actually is, although nominally in public hands, the buses are still privately owned. There's private contracts on a lot of the tubes and so forth. But nevertheless, there's the potential to bring all of that into public ownership, into public hands. Why not have an integrated app that allows you to travel around London on the tubes, the bikes, the buses, and the ride-hailing in the cabs and so forth, whilst also giving workers the right to unionise, to form a unionised workforce that can fight for better conditions. That would be the real approach to these sort of solutions. But it's not raised by the reformists because it raises precisely the kind of questions they're afraid of tackling, the question of ownership and so forth. And that's really the central problem to UBI. It doesn't concentrate on this class question, on the question of who owns and controls the technology in society. And actually, interestingly, Marx had this same kind of polemical debate with the reformists of his time, actually. He had it with a group called the Lassalleans, who had produced this Gotha program that he felt necessary to critique. And you can buy the critique of the Gotha program somewhere at the back as well, I'm sure. But in it, it's very interesting. He criticizes the kind of reformist socialists for saying, look, you're putting all the emphasis on the question of distribution, constantly talking about distributing the wealth that's already there. But why not talk about production? Why, instead of talking about the inequality that exists within distribution of wealth, why not talk about the inequality in terms of the means of production by which wealth is produced in the first place? And he says if you tackle that question, the inequality of distribution disappears. If you have a more equitable distribution of the means of production, if you have common ownership over the means of production, the means by which new wealth is produced, rather than just trying to tax and spend and distribute the wealth that's already out there, he says then inequality will automatically wither away. And therefore the solution really is not these kind of newfangled, new elaborate tax and spend systems like UBI, which fundamentally leave the whole capitalist dynamic, the whole capitalist system, which is an inherently unequal system, in terms of the fact that the profits are derived from the unpaid labour of the working class. Capitalism necessarily, the wealth of the few depends on the impoverishment and the exploitation of the many. Capitalism is an inherently unequal system. But instead of challenging that, things like UBI, these kind of tax and spend, it always hits the wrong people, actually. Even the taxes themselves hit the wrong people, because the rich will evade the taxes, they will move their money offshore, and actually it'll end up being the middle classes who could be won over to the idea of a planned economy, who end up being hit by these kind of systems. And so therefore, we should say, look, we're in favour of the rich paying, but rather than the only way we're going to get them to pay properly is actually if we expropriate, if we actually take these technologies, these mega monopolies and so forth, these multinationals, into public ownership and democratic control. Now, in that respect, we've got to be very clear that actually the problem with capitalism is not so much its inequality. The actual inequality flows, it's a symptom really of the whole system, as I said. And Trotsky pointed this out himself. I just want to read a little quote from The Revolution Betrayed. He says, "The fundamental evil of the capitalist system is not the extravagance of the possessing classes, however disgusting that may be in itself, but the fact that in order to guarantee its right to extravagance, the bourgeoisie maintains its private ownership of the means of production, thus condemning the economic system to anarchy and decay." I think that very, very well sums up the problem. The problem is not the inequality. That is a symptom of the real problem. The real thing holding society back, our real criticism of capitalism, if you like, is not simply the horrific, and it is horrific, the barbaric inequality that exists in society where 8 billionaires or whatever it is own as much as the bottom 50%. Rather, it's the fact that they, in order to get that wealth, they have private ownership over the technology. They become a barrier to the development of technology, of science, of industry, of society itself. And UBI does nothing to fundamentally solve these problems. In fact, what UBI really shows is it highlights the kind of paradox that exists. It highlights the absurdity that exists, where on the one hand you have this technological unemployment, this millions of people made obsolete, alongside this kind of millions of other people who are forced into overwork, into precarious jobs. The fact that kind of contradiction exists and that UBI highlights it really shows you the real problem that's at play here. And therefore, as I said, at best, UBI should really be considered a transitional demand, if you like, something that highlights the absurdity of these contradictions and is linked to the question of the class struggle, of the need for the working class to take power and take the key levers of the economy into their hands, and it really demonstrates, as I say, the potential for a genuine socialist society, a society based on superabundance, based on a plethora of leisure time. And that in turn, obviously, that plethora of leisure time being the basis for genuine democracy, for the genuine involvement of the masses in the running and planning of society. And interestingly, in the last week, actually, I think it was last weekend, Corbyn actually made a speech. Jeremy Corbyn made a speech on this question of this kind of modern question about technology, about robots and things like Uber and these sort of things. And he actually said Labour's programme is going to be, should be, to put the robots under workers' control and ownership. I think that sounds quite nice. It sounds a lot better than Bill Gates' tax the robots. But we've got to be very clear. I think what Corbyn's he's putting it quite vaguely, and actually what I think he means a lot of the time is the idea of cooperatives. He's even said Uber should be run as a cooperative by the workers. We'd say, no, let's go further. Uber should exist and these sort of services should exist as publicly owned, democratically controlled services, companies and industries and so forth. And if we did that, and if we put these robots and machinery and technology as part of a plan of production, then we could really put into place Marx's maxim of this motto of from each according to their ability, each according to their needs. We are not Luddites. We should make that very clear. We are not against technological progress. We are not against scientific development. We're in favour of automation, of innovation, and all of these sorts of things. But you cannot divorce these from the question of ownership in terms of who runs and controls society. I think a democratic plan of production could share the gains across the whole of society, could share these benefits of technology across society, share the work out, reduce the hours of the working week down to a minimum. Actually, Trotsky himself described the idea that, you could imagine very clearly a world where all it was taken was to pull a lever or press a button. The whole economy whirs into action, and we sit there kind of reaping the rewards of that. But it has to be on the basis of a democratic, rational plan of production, on the basis of a socialist plan of production that allows all of us to fulfill our full potential, that allows us to live in harmony with the planet around us, between ourselves and the planet, between harmony between man and machine, and obviously between each other. And I think this has to be the kind of revolutionary change that we're fighting for, that we do fight for, and this is the programme of the IMT, and I hope you join us in that fight. I'll leave it there.